Okay, I want to welcome, or introduce rather, our panelists today. I'm gonna go ahead and do that now before we run out of too much time. We're approaching, 7:15. Now, we have Miriam Kaba, who is an educator, a writer, and a community leader focused on a variety of issues and topics. An amazing person. Key issue, stopping all people from experiencing violence and ending the incarceration, mass incarceration of people, and abolishing the prison system itself, as well as our police force, the system itself. Now, I'm going to leave that to Miriam to add and to expound upon, and she'll be available to answer all our questions. We also have Allison Albrecht. Allison is a mental health counselor living in Minnesota. And Allison has volunteered in an array of ways with the community, with marches, different things, just too many to name, wearing so many various hats. And we are happy to have both of them here with us to share their knowledge and expertise. Before we get too far into things, I want to, forewarn you. Unfortunately, the prison system and our police system itself is very, very violent, and it's horrific. Understanding that people have experienced horrible situations. Tonight, we will bluntly address those things and discuss these topics. So there may be some triggers for people. If in fact you prefer Twitter, we do have currently our Youth Deaf Persons Support Group. Live Twitter, current right now. Hashtag heard webinar. No, nothing else, just heard webinar. Okay, so now I'd like to bring Allison in, because in our community, we have developed some signs for specific concepts regarding this area. So we want to understand the signs before we go into discussion, because prior to now, there aren't any official signs for these concepts. So we're going to have Allison come in, and I'm going to highlight Allison so everyone can see her go ahead and introduce those signs. So everyone hold for one moment.
Okay. Hello, everyone. So I'm just going to show you just a few signs that we have seen in different communities. The first word is going to be mass incarceration. And I've seen two different signs for that. This is the first one, or this sign here. So either of those. I have seen for juvenile this sign or this sign. For prison, we've seen it this way or this way. And the last sign is immigration. Do you mind, Allison, showing all those signs again? This is TL speaking again. You want me to spell them as well too? Yes, please, if you could do that one more time just to make sure that everyone has it. Okay, so I'll repeat them. The first one is mass incarceration. It's this sign or this sign. The next one is jail. Those are the three signs we've seen for that. And then prison, we've seen it this way or this way. And then the last one is immigration. Okay. Okay, this is TL again. Thank you, Allison. We really appreciate you sharing those signs with us. Our interpreters will be using those same signs throughout the night. Okay. So now we're going to just dive right into tonight's webinar. We do have a few questions for the panel. The first question is a very broad question. Here in the United States, we have more than any other country, more prisoners than any other country. In the past, I'll say like in the 1970s, somewhere in there, we had about 200,000 prisoners. However, currently, 40, 50 years later, we have 2.3 million. Whew, that's awful. And that number does not include persons who are, the 4 million persons who are on probation and parole. So altogether, I think the number is like 8 or 9 million people who are being supervised by the state system. That's interesting. So obviously, there are many different issues that can come up regarding the prison system. I'm just curious if maybe Miriam, can you offer some key reasons behind the explosive number of people in the prison system? And if you can stress that, we'd like to see why there are so many people of color and people in the LGBTQI community, youth, and disabled or deaf and hard of hearing individuals. Why do we see an increase in those numbers now?
Yes, thank you very much for having me. I am thrilled to be here. The question is important. As you mentioned, since the 1970s, we've had a massive increase in the numbers of people caught up in what we call the prison industrial complex, PIC. So you'll hear me use the term PIC a lot because it's not just prison or jail or parole or probation. It's also policing and other forms of control. So what happened is that after the Black freedom struggle of the 1960s, there was a backlash. And the government looked for ways to criminalize particular communities. And they used policy to do that. One of the policies was the war on drugs. The war on drugs funneled a lot of people, particularly people of color, particularly women of color, LGBT people, people who with disabilities, into the system. What also happened was increasing the length of people's sentences. So keeping people in prison longer. That added to the numbers. Another thing that happened was making it more likely that if you committed a crime, you wouldn't get a second chance. So people, both Republicans and Democrats, pushed policies like 3 strikes. So you had a crime, and then you had a second crime, and then maybe you violated your parole. You would find yourself going to prison for long, long sentences for minor crimes. All of those things together made it so that it exploded the numbers of people behind bars. Exploded also the other forms of surveillance and control that the system has over people. Now, I want to say something about people with disabilities and the carceral state. Maybe that's a word people haven't heard a lot. And maybe it's not, since I don't sign, maybe it's not, carceral state isn't something that's signed easily. But you should understand that when we talk about the carceral state, we mean a whole bunch of different ways that people are criminalized in the child welfare system, in the education system, when you go to the hospital and try to access your services, the addiction industry that exists in the treatment industry, and also the ways in which people with disabilities are policed in more harsh and negative ways than other communities are. All of that is a funnel into the carceral state, into the prison system, the PIC as a whole. Yes, that's it.
This is TL. Thank you so much, Miriam, for that clarification and elaborating on what's been happening historically. I wonder if Allison has anything to add or wants to expound or clarify any key points. Give me 1 second. Yeah, I would like to add, this is Allison. We have seen the statistics and we are aware that here in the United States, about 20 to 25% of those individuals are disabled. And the prison system, and about 60 to 80% are people with some type of disability. At the same time, we know that in the 70s, we saw a diverse a diverse style of institutionalization. Allison, I'm so sorry to interrupt you. I think we were clarifying for the interpreter your percentages. Do you mind going back? That 20% you spoke of the culture, and the 60% that can you clarify those numbers for me? Sure, I'm sorry. Okay, yes, I will go back. Here in the United States, we're full of, as a whole, there's 20 to 25% of people with disabilities, disabled people here. But when you look at the prison system, that whole conglomerate, it's 60 to 80% of people that are incarcerated, they have disabilities. Okay, yes. So now, about in the 70s, something else happened. The institutionalization of people with mental health issues, people that were placed in institutions, were being transferred to the community, experiencing group home settings. But not everyone did not benefit from that service. They did not have resources. They were hard to get access to those resources. So we ended up with a lot of people back in the prison system. And it was 10 times more people who have mental health issues in prison than in the mental institutions, in those hospitals. So that's another factor that impacts people with disabilities. Yeah. Thank you. Thanks, Allison. This is TL, speaking directly to Allison now. Thank you. I wonder if you think we should go ahead with the poll. Do you think? Can we hold 1 second? Yes? Okay, thank you. Great. Look at our feedback. Okay, now we have a second question for both of you, our panelists. It seems that the issue of police brutality has, let me go back a little bit, no problem. It seems as though the issue of police brutality and the court system has really been, in court and justice have really been prevalent. And also the violence in the prisons and in the jails. Now that it seems like this is more of a hot topic, and it's a very popular issue that people are really discussing and going back about. It's a big debate now. It's much more debatable now than before. So I'm curious, the two of you, what do you think is the reason behind this whole, it's a hot topic and people are more willing to discuss these issues? And secondly, what have you been doing to help encourage the dialogue on this topic? We'll start with Miriam.
Yes. So speaking to why the topic of policing and violence is so, as you said, hot, or, people are paying more attention, I think we can't forget the current Black Lives Matter mobilizations and organizing that has brought the issue to a broader public, that has made the issue impossible to ignore. One of the things I have found interesting in the work I've been doing in the last few years has been the ways in which the community, the disabled community, has interfaced with these issues to help educate all of us more about the need to be more intersectional in our analysis and in the solutions we propose. So when the movement for Black Lives put out a vision statement a couple of years ago, I think it was people from the Harriet Tubman Collective who put out a statement bringing up the fact that disability justice really got a short shrift within that document, and therefore within our analysis of the problem. If we don't really get the analysis of the problem right, we can't find the solutions. So I have been interested in watching and listening to friends and people who are involved with Sins Invalid and some of these other groups that have been dramatizing the ways in which police interface with people with disabilities on a daily basis in very violent ways. So we've learned a lot about why, asking a question that I think is very important. Why are we using the police to respond, for example, to mental health crises? Why are they the first responders to mental health crises that occur within our communities and our families? Why do we need people with guns to be wellness check people? Shouldn't we have people who are trained in de-escalation, trained in addressing mental health crises? Social workers, why are they in existence if not to help address those problems in our communities? So I've been learning quite a bit about the numbers. I think it was like 50 to 60% of police brutality victims are people with disabilities of various sorts. That's scary. That's awful. And it's not surprising, though, if you think about why that is, right? Why people with various forms of disabilities might come into more contact with the police, because people don't know how to deal with folks. And so they call the cops right away as a first reflex. Yeah. So I think those are two things I'm thinking about, you know, both the movement for Black lives and that mobilization and organizing. The fact that people are teaching us within that movement more about how to incorporate disability justice within our lens and our analysis and our solutions. And then the fact that we really need to stop calling the cops when we're addressing mental health crises. They should not be the first line of defense or the first people we bring in. We need to really rethink that. And there are groups around the country that are doing just that, that are doing mental health 101s, first response processes without the cops, alternatives to responding to mental health crises, for example, without police. There are people doing trainings in Chicago, on the West Coast, in other places just around those topics. So I'm encouraged by that. And I try to lift up those stories and lift up those examples as much as I can in my own work.
I think that everything that Miriam has said was on point. On point. Yes, on target. I agree. The Black Lives Matter really brought a lot of spotlight to these concerns. But these concerns have been ongoing. And finally, people are discussing it more and more open about it. I also think that a big thing that helps our community to be aware is heard in their organization. Our deaf community, deaf, disabled, deaf, blind, hard of hearing, it's not something that's discussed much about incarceration. And we hadn't discussed it until Heard got the word out. So my hat's off to Heard. What I've been doing locally, working in Minnesota, it's been great working with the people here. I've been really working with the groups here and raising awareness, becoming a better resource for people in our community. Yeah. Thank you both. Now, Allison, she's a little humble. This is TL speaking. Now, as far as peers and mental health support program, you started that and you led that, correct, Allison?
Well, Minnesota has a deaf certification for support program here for working with individuals who have a disability. It's not, there are other peer support programs nationally, and they have other deaf peer support persons in other states. However, here in Minnesota, we have set up the first certified deaf CPS. So yes, that part is true. Yes, thank you. Okay, thank you. I want to move on to the next question. It's related with the educational system. Currently, we notice that, there's a lot of different studies and communities that have proof of stories that are being shown, and the connection between the education system and the prison system. We need to start the topic of school to prison pipeline. That's also been a discussion as well. Do you guys mind sharing what the school to prison pipeline is? And have you seen the impact on the youth that are in school? Miriam, do you mind answering that question?
Sure. So maybe we can start by talking about what is the school to prison pipeline. It is all of the policies and the practices that push children out of schools into juvenile and criminal justice systems. We know for a fact that many of these children have histories of learning disabilities, of poverty, abuse, and neglect. And instead of focusing on providing additional educational and counseling services, instead those children, when they go to school, are met with zero tolerance policies. Those zero tolerance policies really criminalize minor infractions or minor problems with school rules. And many people who are listening will also know that if you have children and you are living in an urban setting in particular, there might be cops in schools. And having police officers in schools can also lead children and students to be criminalized for behavior that used to be handled in the principal's office. And I mentioned the people who are particularly vulnerable to being pushed out and to having discriminatory application of discipline policies are students of color, poor students, students who are victims of abuse at home and neglect, and students with learning disabilities. That's really, really important. I also want to point out that there are numbers to back this up, that students who qualify for special education often get targeted for repeated violations of disciplinary policy in schools. Students with disabilities are more than twice as likely to receive out-of-school suspensions. So 13% of the students around the country that receive out-of-school suspensions are students with disabilities. Students without disabilities, only about 6% of them get out-of-school suspensions every year. Students with disabilities make up about 12% of the overall population. They make up 25% of students involved in school-based arrest. They make up 58% of all students that are placed in seclusion. And they make up 75% of all students that are physically restrained at schools. And if you're really thinking about intersectionality in our analysis, students of color with disabilities are even more likely to be targeted. or even more likely to be suspended and expelled from school. So it has a real impact. And I've worked for many years through my work at Project NIA, my organization, with children who did not get the proper IEP, the individual education plan that they should have gotten under the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, for example, in their school. That act is not fully implemented in many schools. So students don't get the services that are mandated to them because they're struggling with disabilities and they're not getting those services. They're not getting those individualized supports that they really need to be able to follow the work, to be able to not be in a position of being disruptive because whatever's going on, nobody's there to actually attend to their needs. They're seen as bad and lazy and defiant, when in fact they're struggling with various forms of disability, and that if those were addressed, they would be just fine. So that's a little bit about the school to prison pipeline and how it directly intersects with the lives of our school kids who are suffering from various forms of struggle and challenge of all kinds, poverty and all sorts of other issues, abuse, and also who just have disabilities and need more individualized support.
I can go ahead. Okay. This, for me right now, it feels I feel like my work as a school counselor in different schools that I've worked at through the years, I've always seen the same thing, same pattern of students of color, often targeted for punishment and suspension, more in school consequences than other white deaf students. And if you look at simple things like who's being suspended, you'll see the most percentage that those are students of color, the largest percentage, and the consequences for the white deaf students are not the same. Even students that do have accommodations, students that do have IEPs and things like that, you'll see sometimes the BIP, the BIP plan, behavior intervention plan, included in there. And it'll say, call the police as part of their BIP plan, And so there's really a lot of quick decisions made about the students, those students who have disabilities, because maybe they've experienced trauma or their home life is having an impact and they really don't understand. So then they come to school and they don't look like they're prepared, or they seem to just be sitting and not paying attention, or they seem to not be cooperative. But those things, the teachers and the staff, administrators, they kind of get tired of that. Oh, they're not respectful, they're not cooperative, and they have all these consequences, and then they're punished and they become at risk for just being lost in the system, in the juvenile system or the court system, or being involved with CPS and even immigration services is all messed up.
Thank you both. That really helps us understand a great deal. This is TL. Not everything, but that does help us address some issues. Nationally, it's a national issue, not just small communities. I'm noticing that people are on here saying, yes, amazing information. They're really responding. I know you guys can't see that, but I'm thanking you guys for your feedback from the community also. Thank you. This last question before we wrap up. We've already learned so much from you guys. Now we need to take action. So maybe you can provide some concrete details about what it is we can do to support people who may be getting ready or headed toward the prison system. Maybe our youth, they are in line for prison, some of them. So maybe, maybe keep preventing someone from going back to prison. Or maybe Allison herself can, as a white allyship, working as allyship, not an ally. We don't use that term anymore, not an ally, but working in allyship with us. So maybe we'll have Miriam first.
Hi, yes, there's a lot of things to do. I would say first and foremost, if you've been interested in our conversations today, you can get further educated about all of these issues. I'd like to suggest a great book that would be a good introductory book that you might be interested in getting. It's called Understanding Mass Incarceration. It's by an author named James Kilgore. And it's a very easy book to read. It addresses the issues we talked about here. What are the roots and the history of mass incarceration? How does mass incarceration affect particular populations? He also does a very good job of talking about, gender and race and all of the things we've been addressing here in our own way today. So pick up James's book. I'm not getting any profits, but I'm just suggesting it, especially for those of you who are introductory to this stuff. So read books. You can go to my website, usprisonculture.com, and there's a whole reading list on there for people. So get educated. The second thing I would say is take action around the issues that are most important to you. Use your interest to determine where you're going to fight. You don't have to fight everywhere. You can't. You're one person. But figure out what's your passion and go after that. So I'm thinking a lot about, for me, I do a lot of work with young people and youth. So, I like to work with other people that do the same thing. There's a organization called Dignity in Schools campaign. And I've been part of the Dignities in Schools campaign for many years. And some of the campaigns we're working on is to get cops out of schools, for example. Why are they in schools? Criminalizing our children further. Dignity in Schools campaign also does a lot of work around highlighting the disparities that children with disabilities and who are in special ed face. So if that's an interest of yours, connect. You can find them online. I would also say that if you're interested in police and policing, there are many, many resources to look at, including you can go to the Movement for Black Lives site. You can look and see where people are taking action and running various kinds of campaigns in the cities and towns you live in. You can be very mindful of asking the question, why is all this money in your budgets going to policing and prisons and the military? You can insist that those monies go to our communities to support the needs that we have instead. Be active in your community. Ask yourself, who is your district attorney in your community? Who's the person who has the biggest amount of power to decide who is charged when crimes occur? It is the DA. And yet so many of us, so few of us don't even know who our DA is. Find out who that person is. And if they aren't doing what you think is right, if they are acting not in the interest of your community, vote them out. Figure out who that person is, hold them accountable. And then finally, I would just say, for me, another concrete thing that all of us can be doing is not to keep asking for more tough sentences and tough on crime rhetoric. Stop asking people to keep incarcerating people. Ask for alternatives to incarceration. Think about transformative and restorative justice instead. Get away from the punishment mindset. Rethink all of that. And then that's the only way we're going to uproot this situation, in order to uproot oppression and end this kind of the various violences that people experience within the system. So those are suggestions that are concrete, I think, that you could take on.
Yes. I love what Miriam said about not feeling like you have to fight every battle. Pick the thing that you're passionate about and that could make an impact and make a difference. And that's important. I encourage people to get involved with her. Follow on Twitter, Facebook, or bring them to your local community for trainings. That helps a great deal, and it starts the process. If you're working with a school or in a school, ask more questions about what the policy is and why the students are treated different when you notice it. We need a lot of advocating for mental health services and treatment, drug treatment for deaf, blind, hard of hearing people, all in different states. Many of them have nothing. So we need more avocation in that area. I want to go back to something TL mentioned in the beginning. TL mentioned this is not accessible for people who are low income or maybe not have access to technology. That's another thing we can do. Leave today and find information for our communities. Find ways to fund or support those individuals for the next webinar. Thank you. Thank you for participating in our discussion and being willing to learn on these important topics.
Can I say one thing, TL?
Yes.
I do want to say that it's important. A lot of the conversation we're hearing about jails and prisons these days is that they are, quote unquote, the largest providers of mental health services in the country. That's the language and that's the thought, and that's what's being really pushed out of there by reformers and sometimes by other, people who should know better. And there's a great writer and thinker named Liat Ben-Moshe, Liat, Ben, Ben-Moshe, Liat Ben-Moshe, who has written a lot. She's written a book called Disability Incarcerated. Disability Incarcerated. It's a great anthology with lots of essays in there written for people with disabilities, who are thinkers and writers, and talking about the connections between those issues and the carceral state. And one thing I learned from them was that they were saying, in fact, people who go to jail and prisons get terrible mental health services. Those are not places that offer people ways to actually heal and get better. In fact, when you go to prison and jail, you come out worse. So given that that's the reality of the situation, we probably should stop calling prisons and jails the largest mental health providers in the country. They're not providing mental health. They are making people's mental health worse. And I just want, if that's something that you might take away with you in this conversation, the next time you hear somebody say that, push back and say, well, no, that is not a mental health provider, not even a mental health provider of last resort. It's a terrible, terrible place to go to, prisons and jails. Jails and prisons are terrible places. They do not enhance your mental health. So if you had a mental health problem before you went into prison and jail, you are having one worse when you come out. And if you didn't have one before you went in, you probably have one when you're coming out. So I just want that to be a point that people really hammer home, particularly if you're people who are doing work around issues related to people with various forms of disabilities, that is something that should be raised, and people should be fighting on that front, really arguing with people who make that point as though that's a good thing. Thank you. I just wanted to say that.
Thank you. That was perfect. I can see all of the comments in the chat that's just really agreeing and echoing with that. It's, saying yes, and not rehabilitation, but we need to get rid of that word too, because that's not true. So we can see all of the echoes in the comments. So the time has really run out on us. It's almost 8 o'clock, but I really, really want to thank everyone for joining this webinar and who helped support this webinar, the live tweeters for this webinar, the captioners, CSC. I'd like to thank both interpreters, Toy and Jackie, and of course, our panelists, and everyone who joined in and commented on the chat as well. Thank you, thank you, thank you for watching. The next webinar will be next month, and it will be better. You know, we will have the issues ironed out, but thank you all so much for your patience. The topic for next month will be organizing and mobilizing for liberation. It's going to be February 27th. And now, understand this is for the West Coast. On the West Coast, it's going to be 10 to 11 in the morning. And then for the East Coast participants, it will be from 1 until 2. So the panelists for next week will be Benro, I'm sorry, interpreter can't pronounce his last name. Ogunyipe. And also we will have Dustin Gibson. And lastly, we will have Linda Brown. So we hope that you all will join us for next month's webinar and help us to improve and get the word out. I'm going to send out a link where you all can click to watch this webinar. Also, I see in the chat here that a lot of people are saying thank you to our panelists. We have different states represented. We have Utah and just everywhere. People are sharing where they're from. There's a lot of excitement about this. So we do have to wrap up now. I thank you all so much. I thank everyone. The name of our youth person who's supporting and co-coordinating, the name of that person is Micah Lewis. It's important that you all know who that person is because she supported us a lot here. So thank you. Thank you. Okay, bye-bye.
Oh, sorry. I gotta get out. How do I get out? Oh, there it is.
Everyone's staying. Nobody wants it. They are at home. Yeah. Okay, so where's the last one? Talk to you later. Bye.